everyone, Hafsa here. Last lesson we've reviewed the 12 principles of animation and we talked a little bit about what they are for and when we will encounter them. In this lesson we're going to actually start the production of our animation, starting with the character design. This is where we're actually going to start learning about roles that you can do in the industry and the starting point of most of the animation that you're going to do. This pre-production stage is something that doesn't actually require any knowledge in animation, but you do need to keep animation in mind when you're designing your characters and backgrounds, because unlike illustration, they're going to be used and designed with a purpose in mind. The character designer and background artist are basically concept artists. These artists will be the designers and the people responsible for the entire looks and asset of the animation project. With their work, your team will have a guideline to refer to and think about when performing their other role in the animation pipeline. And you can also use it to give your clients a better understanding of what they're going to get in the final product. This is also good for independent animators to refer to when keeping track of their projects and making sure that every scene in a long project is being drawn correctly with the right style. The character designer specifically has to make sure that the design is being kept consistent throughout the entire project. Now, because a character designer doesn't actually have to animate, you'd think that they only need to be concerned about the design principles that we've talked about with the animation principles in the last lesson. But this is not true, because the character designer's job is to create a design that is both appealing visually, while keeping in mind that the design is actually going to be used in animation. So a good character designer will consider both the physics behind the character design, so that the animator will have a clear understanding on how the character is going to move, and about the animation techniques themselves and the workload given to the animators, because if you design something that is too complex or not very well thought out, you might delay the entire animation process. So a character designer will consider the actual work behind the animation when creating their design. This is especially true when you are an independent animator which is responsible for every step in the animation process, because you need to both understand your character design in order to move it, and you need to make sure that the design is fit to your level and that you can efficiently draw it a large amount of times in order to keep on schedule with your independent project. Think about the amount of time it takes you to draw one drawing of your original character. It might be a couple of minutes, it might be a couple of hours. Now think about how you might need to draw them up to 24 times for a single second of animation. As an independent animator, you can control how many details your design will have and save yourself a lot of effort. You need to be able to design a character which can be efficiently drawn multiple times, because you will have to make every step of the animation process. With that in mind, let's look at how we start designing our characters. We need to make sure that they're physically capable of moving and that we understand their anatomy, proportions, and keeping them appealing to the audience. The main topic of today's lesson is understanding your character shape and physics that relate to it. Animation comes in many different styles, from cartoon to anime to even 3D and stop motion animation. And the thought process and physics behind the way each character design is going to move is unique to that design. Because a small child or an old man or a bodybuilder will not move in the same way, because their proportions and force behind their movement is going to be different, as we're going to see in the later videos. You want to think about how the shapes and proportion of your characters are going to affect your design straight from the beginning, so you won't have a hard time animating it later on. Ideally, you want a design that clearly communicates the idea of your character while keeping the design interesting and functional for the animation process, and working with the overall art style of your backgrounds and effects. When designing a character, there are three main things we need to consider. Practicality, which means how easy it is for us to draw the character efficiently a large amount of times. The physics behind the character, meaning that we can clearly understand how the character is going to move. And the aesthetics of the character, meaning that the overall design clearly communicates the idea and personality of the character. This can be done with three simple steps. For practicality, you want to design your character with simple and workable shapes from the get-go, which help you understand the overall proportions and the design of your character. For this, you just need to use simple geometrical shapes for the different body parts of your character to create the overall silhouettes and proportion of the design. As you can see here, I basically just draw very rough, flat shapes to create the overall design of my character. Next, we want to actually separate each part of the character body into the body parts and volumes that will help us feel like the character is drawn in 3D space. For this, we just take the basic shapes that we created the character from and try and make them into 3D shapes. So squares become cubes, triangles become cones, and circles become spheres. This way, we can later on draw details in a way that makes the character feel more realistic. Again, for this step, you can either try and make a geometrical shape and then add curved lines onto them to make them seem more 3D, or you can go to the 3D stage straight ahead. If you're really experienced, you can kind of go over these two stages and skip over to the next one immediately. The next stage is to help us decide the aesthetics of the character. This is where you will refine your volumaic shape that we did before and add the approximate location of the character details and the overall design. If you're experienced, you can just skip to this stage immediately, and remember that you want to try and make it seem as 3D as possible. This part is more related to the details added to your character, and we will look at it more closely in the next lesson. For this one, we're only going to focus on the character proportions and your physics behind the character body. Now that we know the overall process to starting your character design, we want to focus about how to make that design functional, appealing, and with the correct physics. Now, animation is a visual medium, which means that you want your audience to understand what is happening on the screen through watching alone. This means that you want to use the simplest visual cues to achieve your audience understanding of your character. To demonstrate this, I will be using silhouettes and I will be skipping directly to the third stage of the base character design and won't be using the volumaic shapes or the simple shapes. If you're feeling confident in your skills, you can skip to this stage directly as well, but if you feel like you're more of a beginner, you can try and make something similar with simple shapes and then go through the 3 stages as we've seen before. So, by having a strong and readable silhouette, you can make sure that your design is being communicated clearly at first glance. There are several base character archetypes that are commonly used in the media, which are male and female teens and adults, and young children who commonly have a similar body type at that stage. Of course, in real life there are more than just these character archetypes, and there are many variations with each body type that can be played with when designing your characters. But for the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to be showing a very basic guidelines to creating character archetypes. In general, you can distinguish what type of characters you're designing only by their base proportions. The most obvious proportions are present in children, because in general, children will tend to have bigger heads and shorter limbs, which give them a distinct appearance no matter what their body type is. You can still recognize them as children. Next we have teens, which are at a stage of transitioning between children and adults, and in most media this will be shown mostly through just height difference. Sometimes it can be kind of jarring, especially when the characters are older teens, which usually have the same body types as adults but are still going to be shown as shorter just to communicate that they are teens. A good way to show that a character is a teen is just to shift their proportions slightly to make them more awkward and seem a little bit undercooked, as I like to call it. You give them slightly bigger heads and limbs which are slightly longer than what they're usually going to be, as well as make their shoulders slimmer and sloppier, just to show that they are not quite finished growing yet. These kind of proportions work well for all body types, but they might vary depending on your art style and the characteristics of your design. The last archetype is adults. Here you will find character with the most balanced torso to limb ratio, but this is also where you're going to find the most variation in body types within a character archetype, because the lifestyle of the character is going to greatly affect the body types and proportions that they're going to have. Small changes will be made depending on your art style and the characteristics you want to give to your character design, but in general, adults will have smaller heads, wider shoulders, and will be taller. Knowing these proportion shortcuts will help you choose the right shape balance for your character design to later base your volumaic shapes on. The character body language and unconventional proportions will have a significant effect on the way that the design is going to be understood by the audience and the viewers. For example, if you have an average, boring character build, you can give them more personality by having a more interesting posture. You can also clue the audience to the character lifestyle by giving them specific characteristics which are associated to it. You can play around with your character's proportions and base shape to give a more interesting variations to your cast, or even to create a different art style altogether. Sometimes different proportions can indicate different types of animations or even different types of creatures which are inhuman. These changes, however, will affect the way that your character is going to move, so we need to be mindful of them, unless you're aiming for completely unrealistic animation which does not take usual physics into account. Then again, you will still need to be mindful of your character proportions, because if you completely ignore them, they're going to look really weird when they are moving. So, to make sure that we completely understand how the character is able to move, we need to analyze their range of movement. I've been talking a lot about volumes all this time, and they are extremely important when creating animation, because this is what gives the effect of a good design which moves correctly. But this might actually be quite tricky for beginners, because a lot of the time you would not yet know how to make correct volumaic drawings at that stage. So, basically, this is where the question of how do you do anatomy so well comes in. Now, if you think about it, depending on your art style and your character design, your character will definitely not be anatomically correct. You don't usually see animation of characters with realistic proportions, especially in kid animation. So what people actually mean when they ask me how do you do anatomy correctly is how do you keep your character correct all the time? And this is where the volumes are going to keep your character consistent. In essence, the volumes are what helps you make the illusion of your character looking like a 3D model while being a 2D drawing. By understanding the character volumes and keeping them consistent, an animator can draw the character in every pose and angle possible. This is also why being a good illustrator is not important to being a good animator, and why I think a lot of beginners can make good animation as well. Because what is important when you're designing your character is not the overall look of your character, but how consistent you can keep it. So basically, as long as you can keep the size of each part of your character correct, you can make sure that the animation looks as good as it can get, even if the character design itself is not as pretty or as polished. You can even do that with stick figures, as long as you can keep their limbs and, well, sticks at the correct size. As we've seen before, there are 3 simple steps that we are going to use to make our character into a volumaic shape. So the first step is understanding the basic shapes of your characters, as we've done before, and now we're trying to transform them into a more 3D look. To do that, we need to make sure that we're only using curved lines, because even a squiggly, kind of choppy curved line is going to have more 3D feel to it than a straight line. I actually find that the best way to create your character in volume is basically just to break it down to simple parts. So you will be dividing your torso, your head, the neck, the hands, limbs, legs, and feet, all into smaller, easier to understand shapes, which overlap with each other. This creates the character skeleton and the main masses of the character's body. This will also affect how we're going to animate the character later on, so you need to make sure that the overall distribution of your character weight seems realistic and that it won't topple over. Be extra mindful on the connections between your character's limbs, because this is where you're going to be able to show the character volume in the clearest way. Basically, stuff that is in front is going to be overlapping on top of stuff that is behind. You will need to add extra lines a little bit over the connection points to make sure that your character looks like it is connected as a volume and not just with straight line which make it flat. You also need to be mindful that the curve of the line is fitting to the overall shape you've been using as a base for the character proportions. By dividing your characters into smaller parts and making sure that the relative size is being kept, you will be able to draw your characters correctly each time, while keeping their character design and anatomy. This is also where stuff gets a little bit tricky, because sometimes you will have completely disproportionate characters, which will not allow you to have the same range of movement as other characters. For this reason, we're going to first test our character's range of movement when creating and designing them, and trying to keep that in mind for every design that you're going to make for animation. Now that we understand how to make volumes a little bit better, and how we keep our character consistent, we need to make sure that we understand the volumes of our own design and character. Because each design is going to have a specific look to it, which is going to move differently. And we want to make sure that we're always able to draw it consistently. For this, we're going to create a character sheet that we can reference from whenever we're working on a specific character. This will help us both keep consistent sizes and proportion ratios, as well as make sure that we're keeping all our details straight. In this exercise, we're only going to focus on the body shape, and we will use something similar in the next lesson where we're going to focus more on details. To create that character sheet, we're first going to use our regular method and create the character proportions using simple shapes from the front and side view. We're going to use the front and side view specifically with a neutral position so we can have the best understanding of the proportions right next to each other without anything obscuring the correct size of anything. At this stage, you need to make sure that the sizes and locations of each joint and body part is correct. So you can either use a guideline in the background, or you can actually use the grid tool, which is directly available in Procreate, or you can just try and eyeball it. Eyeballing it is actually better for an animator because you would not have a grid to reference from most of the time, and the angles and motions of your character might not allow you to directly compare your character's proportions in every frame, so it's better to practice it now when your character is in a very neutral and easy to understand position, and try and eyeball it to make sure that you really understand your character. But if you're not at that stage yet, it's better to focus on just making sure that the sizes are correct. Also, it's better to start with the front view to make sure that you understand the overall silhouette and shape of your character, and then move to the side view, which lets you have more personality and details of your character, such as their thickness and their posture, which will be important to your overall design characteristics. The next step, after we have the blueprints of the characters from the front and sides, is to make the character in a 3/4 view. If you're not used to doing a 3/4 view yet, because it is quite tricky for a beginner, put each blueprint on top of the other and try and connect them with volumic shapes as we've done before. If you're less of a beginner, you can just skip these overlapping blueprints and jump straight to a 3/4 view. Again, make sure that each body part is in the correct size in relation to each other. It's important to have a 3/4 view of your character because this is how we're going to express the volumes of it in the clearest way. This will give you the best reference to use to create any other angle that you're going to work within the animation. After you have the rough 3/4 view, you can actually go with a different line over it and exaggerate as necessary to emphasize your design points. Figuring out the character's range of movement is actually the most important thing you need to know as an animator. Now, this is not quite as relevant for a character designer because they're not going to move the character, but they do need to keep that in mind when creating the character because it's going to be used in animation. When designing a new character as an independent animator, or when receiving a new animation sheet as a contracted animator with a team project, the first thing you need to know is how to recognize and analyze the proportions and the range of movement of the characters. Depending on the art style, in animation we don't actually have realistic proportions. So you might need to recognize where the character's joint and center of mass is to really understand which poses are possible for your character to make. The concept of center of mass in animation is not something that I've seen referenced a lot, even though I find it to be very beneficial and important to understanding animation. Basically, the center of mass is the point where the entire character mass is balanced, and as long as this center of mass is on top of the base of the character, the base being the support point of your character, which are usually, the legs on which the character stands upon, but it can also be the hands if the character is holding onto something or is leaning on the ground. Basically, the center of mass will tell you if your character is balanced or not, which greatly affects the type of movement that the character is going to make. In general, the lower the center of mass and the bigger the base, the more balanced your character is going to be. As you can see here in this demonstration, the range of movement the character has before it becomes unbalanced is smaller the higher the center of balance is. This is important to understand when you're trying to draw dynamic and balanced poses for your character. Because if you try and make your character move while it's too balanced, it's not going to look natural if it moves too much, and vice versa. So in general, the center of mass is usually around the stomach area in humanoid characters. But if you have unrealistic proportions or any other character details which have a lot of mass to them, such as big swords or bags or armor, you might want to shift that center of gravity to a different location on your character, depending on where the extra weight is. You can find it straight away from the proportions of your character when creating them in simple shapes, or you can just put it on your character after creating your character in volumaic shapes. After figuring out where the center of mass of your character is, we need to figure out their entire range of motion. Now, there are actually two types of range of motions that your character can perform, which are the range of movement your character has when it is balanced, and the range of movement your character has when it's unbalanced. Because if you think about it, when you are balanced, there are less motion you can perform and still be balanced. For example, if you try and stand with your leg bent in the position of running, you basically wouldn't be able to pull that off. While if you try and stay balanced with your legs completely off the ground, well, that's not going to work either, is it? You need to understand each type of range of movement. And you also need to understand your character's inherent characteristics. Because, for example, a character with more flexibility might have a bigger range of movement and will be able to keep it balanced in different poses, which might not be possible to a less flexible character. So, to make sure that we understand the complete range of movement of your character, we basically need to see what is the range of each joint of your character's body. For this, we divide the character into smaller shapes and recognize where the joints are located, and just use curves to figure out the entire range of movement from that certain joint. Now, remember that some joints have multiple directions in which the limbs can move. So you might be able to move the limbs in a circular motion or in a folding motion. Make sure that you keep the sizes consistent even when you try for foreshortening. For the beginner artists, if you don't know how to do foreshortening yet, don't worry, we cover that in a later lesson. For now, try and figure it out as you go with smaller and smaller shape, just to make sure that you keep the relative size correct. Character design for animation is a little bit different than character design you'll see in illustration or concept art. In illustration, the design itself is the final product and will usually only be drawn one time by one person. Concept art can be used as an illustration, but it usually serves as a reference for aesthetic guides for the production, which will be done with a different medium, usually in 3D modeling. In comparison, a character sheet in 2D animation is used both as a reference and a method guide to creating your character consistently hundreds of times by every other person who's working on the project. So it needs to be completely understandable and give all the details necessary to be replicated multiple times. To create a good character sheet, you're going to draw your character in 4 to 6 different angles, depending if your character is symmetrical or not. You're going to have the front and side view, as well as the back view and 3/4 view from front and back. These angles are going to give the largest amount of details and the best reference for proportions that you're going to have with a 2D character animation sheet. But you also want to show the type of poses and actions that your character is capable of. So it's better to have additional sheets of characters performing certain dynamic action poses, as well as having your characters drawn in different angles. This is good both as a reference for the other artist in the project, or for yourself to understand the character better. Usually, when I design a new character, I make a couple of sketches of them in advance to make sure that I completely understand how they're going to be drawn in different angles. If you're feeling confident with your character design, you can skip this stage unless you need to present that character to the team or to your client. If it's just for yourself though, feel free to draw as many poses as you feel like to make sure that you have complete understanding of your character. This will also be the best exercise that you can have to improve your character illustration skills. I tend to use base shapes and volumaic shapes, but you can also go straight for the details or start with really simple shapes as well. The best thing to do is actually try and draw your characters with a pen or commit to not erasing anything in them, and gradually try and make your sketches, less sketchy. In general, the clearer your initial character is going to be when doing the rough animation and storyboard, the faster you're going to animate your entire project. And sometimes, if my character design is simple enough, I don't even bother doing a base animation and just go straight with the rough lines of the animation because they already include all the details in the correct proportions. So if you can get to that level, try and design it that way so you can continue the entire course with animation without any base underneath them. But if you're a beginner, it's okay to have the base shapes of your character and practice them until you feel comfortable with your character design and drawing them in different poses. The exercise for this lesson, if you haven't been following the steps up until now, is to create 1 or 2 character body sheets as we've seen in this video. You need to create a front, side, and 3/4 views, as well as several action poses. In this exercise, make sure that you keep your character's proportions correct for each new view, and for extra difficulty, try and make those proportions correct without using grids, and try to make sure that you create correct volumes as well. You can go and create however many poses that you want, but make sure that you have the base 3 views that I've specified for the next lesson. I also really recommend testing your character's range of movement if you know that you want to use it for the later animation exercises. The more you familiarize yourself with the character, the easier it's going to be to animate them later on. And remember, in this exercise, you only need to draw the basic body shapes without any details. So to recap today's lesson, we've learned about using shapes to break down the proportions of your character design and how to manage these proportions to create the look and character archetype that you want to use to make your design clearer for the audience to understand. We learned how to express your character using volumaic shapes and how to determine how the character is going to move based on their joint and center of mass. Next lesson, we're going to learn about the aesthetic sides of character design and how to add the details and animate them correctly later on. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye!